Hello everyone, and welcome once again to my computer here on the internet. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here. My name is Daniel Huffman, and I'm your cartographer for this afternoon. So today, I'm going to try something a little different than I have in the past. I am going to be making a map live in front of all of you. The first couple of live streams that I did in the past, I instead was taking a map that I already made before and breaking it down for everybody, and I think there's some value in that, definitely. Though, it's kind of pre-canned, though, in some ways, if you think about it, right? Everything's sort of already there, and you don't get to see me struggle through some of the process of decision-making or of dealing with errors in GIS or Illustrator, etc. So this is actually sort of a riff on something that I do sometimes in front of classes as well, called Bob Ross Day. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Bob Ross, the host of The Joy of Painting, but this was a guy who would just, on TV, make a painting in front of people. And I think there's a lot of value in watching people work and just watching them sort of go through that process. And I think that's what I get out of conferences and social media a lot of the times, is just glimpses into what my colleagues are doing, and it can kind of remind me of techniques I may have once used before and have forgotten about, or about things that I have about things that I didn't know about. We'll put it that way. So that's my plan today, and specifically I want to make a map in an orthographic projection. I love orthographic projections. They're this sort of imagine the Earth from space kind of thing. And they were really popular, as far as I can tell, kind of in the World War II era in the United States, partly because we started fighting this war overseas, and people in the United States started to get a good sense of the vastness of the globe. And people like Irwin Royce and Richard Eads Harrison did a lot of beautiful maps that give you this sense that you're looking at a globe, or that you're floating in a spaceship somewhere. And so I've tried to emulate that here and there in my own work. I did some maps for an airline last year, I think it was. Yeah, last year, in which I kind of gave this perspective view on the world. So I did a few of these for different regions they flew to. I also tend to do them a lot when I'm traveling. I have this habit of, when I'm about to make a journey, I just make a little map of it. So I went to Anchorage in Alaska a few months ago, last summer, and I just put this map out on Twitter. One thing I think about orthographic projections is they give this sense of vastness. Like, Madison is so far away from Anchorage because you can see it receding in the distance. So I'm really fond of these things, and that's what I want to make today. Just sort of I needed something to help sort of frame. I'm going to make a map for people. What will I do? So an orthographic it is. My original plan had been to make this in QGIS, but it turns out there's a little bit of a challenge with that. And before I move on, I want to say, please make sure to, make use of the chat. Right? This is a live event, and part of the value of the live event is that this is interactive. And I see that Natalie is saying that she'd love for me to be the Bob Ross of cartography, and I appreciate that. I think somebody already called John Nelson that, so I don't know if there's room for two Bob Rosses, but I would be happy to do something like that. And these live streams are definitely part of this. But yeah, the chat is there please feel free to ask questions, make comments, suggest things that I should do different, or just talk to each other about what's going on and about maps. We're all here together, and that's the nice thing about this time, is that it's kind of community time. So, yes, I was going to start off in QGIS, and here I've got a bunch of data loaded in, and this is a great starting point. What it turns out, though, is that QGIS has some challenges in making orthographic projections. And if I just go over here and switch my coordinate reference system, I actually have this Africa orthographic one that I've prepared in advance, when I was messing around last night thinking about where might I make a map of, and just making sure all my technology worked right. You get something like this. So if I just turn these off for a second, this is my ocean layer, which seems to be mostly on land now and has a bunch of weird inversions where parts of polygons are going over each other and it's not able to determine what's inside and what's outside. And if I look at the land, it's not much better. There's some broken pieces. Graticule looks all right, though, for the most part. It turns out there's a lot of complicated effort that goes into creating an orthographic projection in your GIS. And I looked around online, and if you Google orthographic projection in QGIS, you get all these long workarounds. Like, define your projection here, start fixing artifacts by doing all of this code. If you feel like copying that, and figure out how that works. Somebody here posting on Stack Exchange, where did my polygons go when projecting this in QGIS? And clip your polygons to the hemisphere. Other people are even saying rasterize your whole map and that'll work. So it's tough. And so I was talking to my colleague Evan Applegate last night, and it turns out that he does the same thing that I do in this particular situation, and that he goes to IndieMapper. IndieMapper at indiemapper.io is a free online mini map creation tool. It's kind of a little GIS, but it's geared specifically toward creating cartographic products. And it does require Flash to run. This is, nowadays we kind of take things like this almost for granted. There are all these products and companies out there that are that produce all these little online wizards to help people who maybe are less fluent in cartographic techniques and knowledge, to help them produce maps quickly and easily in a little GUI and a wizard. But IndieMapper was one of the early versions of something like that. This came out in 2010, and it hasn't really been updated much in the last 7 or 8 years, but it still works, and it's still pretty valuable as a quick, lightweight, browser-based way to do some basic mapping work. And one of the things that I like about it is it correctly handles orthographic projections. And Andy Woodruff was one of the coders on this thing. He works for Axis Maps, which I should give a thanks to. Axis Maps is the company that keeps this free and built it. He was talking about that it was all worth it losing his hair in 2010 over creating this thing, because people are still using it now, including me today. IndieMapper opens up and it asks you to load in some data, just like you would in a GIS. And one of the nice things is they've got Natural Earth built in. It's a little bit of an older version of Natural Earth, but for what we're doing here, it's going to be pretty much just fine. So I can go to what they call their shapefile library. And this is just Natural Earth data. So I'm going to load in 1 to 50 million physical data of land. And we'll just open that up. And I'm also going to load in, it also asks if I want to thematically symbolize this and make a choropleth or something like that out of it, or a dot density map, which, so if you had thematic data, you could do something like that. I'm going to cancel that, though. It's just going to keep my land areas on there. I can restyle them. I can change my fill color, whatever I might be interested in. Turn off the stroke. We'll do all that in Illustrator, though. I'm also going to open, which is how we add data. We're going to go for oceans here too. Pull that in as well. And cancel that. Don't need to thematically symbolize that at all. And I'm just going to drag my graticule above the oceans and land over it. And now I want to reproject this. And there's this projections panel. And they've got 14 different options here. And it's not as thorough as a GIS. You can't do every single possible thing. But they've got some flexibility. You can change the parameters on any of these. And again, to kind of show the origins and the intent of this system, they've got these learn more buttons so you can find out more about what this projection does. It's designed partly as a teaching tool. It's an expert system for people who don't know a lot about cartography, but if they'd like to learn, it points them in the direction of some resources. So if I just hit apply here, switch over to an orthographic, IndieMapper still also itself occasionally has some orthographic projection problems, like my ocean kind of went away, but they're not bad enough to prevent me from being able to make a map with it. I was doing some testing earlier, and it's going to work out fine even when things get a little wonky. If I go back to Q, right? When I export, well, this isn't going to get any better. But there are some errors that crop up in IndyMapper that can be cleaned up in Illustrator. From here, this is kind of a little bit of trial and error in finding where you want to center your projection. Because right now we're at 0, 0, latitude, longitude. And indeed, right here in the middle of the graticule, that's the middle of my globe. And as I move my standard point, if I were to move my standard point west, for example, over here to 30 degrees, that's the equivalent of sort of rotating the entire globe, and Africa is going to get farther and farther to the right. So if I go, negative 30 degrees longitude, and there we go, Africa is rotated right. So it's a little bit of messing around to kind of find where you want to center this thing. It gives a good view, and sometimes what I've done is I've actually taken a physical globe and held it up in front of my face, and until I kind of have the right perspective and the right view that I want, and then just kind of figured out, well, what latitude and longitude is roughly in the center of my eye right now while I look at that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a map, I've decided, though, of the Indonesia, Philippines, sort of the Malay archipelago area. So let's kind of jog over a little bit to 90 degrees east and see where we're at. Yeah, so kind of this area here. Now I want to still get a pretty nice sort of perspective on things. I want some of this area to be more toward the edge of the globe, where it's going to be rotating away from me. So I'm probably going to want to move my latitude down a little bit. And again, my ocean's getting a little wonky. We'll turn that off. We're not. I have a way to kind of get away with not using that at all. So now it's starting to get kind of a little curvature, a little perspective for it. I like that. Let's move down a little bit more. Let's do like 45 degrees. Okay, so now you may think, well, what happened? It's some sort of error with the way it's interpreting polygons that kind of fall off the backside of the Earth. But I tested this out earlier, and it turns out there's just one big red polygon on top, and if you got rid of that red polygon, all the rest of your stuff should be fine and safe underneath. So what I'm going to do here is we'll test that out. I'm going to export this thing. I'm going to export this as a layered SVG file, a vector file we can open up in Illustrator. And sure, I'll call it Untitled. I'm going to generate that file and then export it to my computer. And it just drops on my desktop here. And I can open that up in Illustrator. But if I go quickly to the outline mode, Command Y, I can see all of my stuff is still there. It's still safe and correctly projected, thankfully. So I'm just going to go immediately to my direct selector and delete that. And now we're mostly fine. You can get a couple of wonky lines here in the graticule, maybe delete that one. But overall, that looks pretty decent. I could make something work with this, and especially what I'm envisioning is that I'm not going to show the whole planet. Kind of like these other examples, we're just going to show part of it. Here I got Africa, and Royce has Africa, and Harrison has South America. So if I'm just imagining clipping things down to maybe this region here of Australia, Oceania in general, that's probably going to be fun. There is one other thing that I want to do, and it gives me a chance to show off one other item in IndyMapper. So you can load your own data, and what I'd like here is I'd like a little quick reference guide for some island names. What are some of these things called? So I'd like to load in a shapefile that has some of those data. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go back first to Qgis, and I'm going to make this thing look more normal. I'm going to take this back to just a geographic coordinate system, WGS84. I just hit the button down here on the right to change systems. If you're not too familiar with QGIS, one great thing is it's got a real robust support community online. And if you're transitioning over from something like ArcMap, you can usually just Google QGIS equivalent and then the name of the thing you wanted to do when it was called an ArcMap, and someone will tell you how to do that thing. What I've got in here is I've got the Natural Earth Geographic Regions file. So it's got the names of mountain ranges and continents and everything. What I'd really like is just the names of some islands, though. So I'm going to go to the attribute table here and sort by feature class. Have a look for just the islands. So this way I'll be able to load this into IndieMapper and pull that in and just label the island names so that my Illustrator file has those sitting there, so I don't have to look them up anywhere. So I've got those selected now. Got those highlighted, and there's some ones outside of the region, but that's fine. I'm just going to export and save my selected features as a new shapefile here. I'm going to browse around and just dump this on my desktop for now. Islands. And keep that in. IndieMapper is pretty picky about what it'll import, but one of the few things it will import in shapefile coordinate systems is just plain geographic coordinates in WGS84. So now I can go back into IndieMapper, and just to help make clear what I'm doing, I'm going to kind of move this back to where it wasn't so wonky. So now we can see what I've loaded in. I'm going to say open. That's their button for adding stuff in. I can use my data using the Your Data tab here. So I need to browse for a shapefile. They were also importing KMLs and GPXs. This was before like GeoJSON files were popular or maybe even existed. I'm not sure how old they are. So IndieMapper's been around a while. Good workhorse though. So I'm just going to open my island shapefile, and it also asks if I want the DBF, which I do. That's got the names in it, the database with the attribute table. And we'll say load that up. And there we go. I've got a new file dropped in right on top. And I would like to add map labels from this using name as the field. Now another thing I discovered recently about IndieMapper. This wasn't the case as of maybe a year or two ago, but while it has labeled these things, right now they're not showing up in the browser, but they will show up again in your SVG. So kind of like with our projection, we got to take this on faith a little bit that it's going to work out. But I find it kind of amusing, and again, like while I have these comments about some things that aren't working, it's really a cool program and fun to work with. So I'm going to go back, shift my projection a little bit back to 45 we had. That was pretty good. And we'll close that up. I'm going to make my labels a little bit smaller. I just, when I'm labeling things in a GIS, just like to make sure that they're small enough so it's clear to me when I'm adjusting them later what thing they go with. So we'll say, let's make those 6 point. All right, and let's export it. Try it again. We'll generate another untitled SVG and drop that in there. We'll replace the old one. And back to Illustrator. And I'm just going to revert this because I'm going to load the new one from disk. Yeah, there we go. So it worked. And I've got all kinds of data. I've got all kinds of labels on islands and things. So I can start cleaning this thing up and getting it ready and organized. So I'm going to get rid of that weird polygon, going to get rid of some of this stuff, that extra bit of graticule, just deleting those. And now I got to take this thing and start to organizing it. It's everything comes in a map layer with little clipped groups that match every layer that you had in IndieMapper. So here's my original land shapefile, here's my graticule, and so on. So I want to turn these into layers in Illustrator because, if I have all these together now and I just unclip them, well, then they're all going to get dumped in the same layer and it's going to be a mess. So I got to organize stuff. So I just start turning things on and off and figuring out what they are. So this is land. I know that this thing here is land. And what do we got next? Whoops. So that was my streaming dashboard there. There we go. We'll see a little behind the scenes of checking how my stream's going. So what else do we have here? All right, need my graticule. And then I need, what else do we have here? Those are my labels. Turn those off, and then I don't really need those shapes. Those shapes were just there for me to know where the islands were. And then what's in here? Just my neat line and such, just the edge of my map and my background, it looks like. So we can ditch that. And there's all the pieces. So Natalie is asking if I've ever tried to make an orthographic map with bathymetric data. Now I've not tried that specifically, but I could see that, I mean, bathymetric data are often in raster format, and my impression is that raster data project with orthographic a little bit more cleanly. I mean, one of the pieces of advice that I saw online was to rasterize your stuff in Qgis, and it should be fine, because a lot of the challenge comes from what happens when you have a shape that wraps around the planet. And it mathematically has some trouble figuring that out. But rasters are pixel by pixel, can easily figure out that something's occluded and not show it, versus something being kind of split between visible and not visible if it's a polygon. And if you're using bathymetric polygons, it's probably going to run into the same problems. But at least if you can rasterize things, it should be fine. And I've made orthographics in ArcMap, and those work fine. I've never really run into any of these issues. But that's that's enterprise software, and they've sort of got the resources to tackle something this complicated is part of the problem. And I should mention too about raster is that IndieMapper is a vector program. It doesn't, to my knowledge, doesn't really have a way to ingest raster data, so it is a little limited in that way. But for a free browser-based tool from 10 years ago, it's pretty useful for some of these quick one-off situations. And I've definitely been times when I could do something in QGIS, and I just think, this is going to be easier. I just need to really fast throw, Australia onto a Mercator projection or something like that, and I can do that pretty quickly there and get it into Illustrator. But that is a great question. Thanks for asking. So yeah, now I've got my pieces together here. What I want here is, I was having some trouble with my ocean before, so I'm going to want an ocean layer too, I think. And part of the challenge is that I don't have an ocean polygon, but I can make one pretty easily just using pieces of the graticule. Oh, I've still got these clip groups too. I should probably unclip and ungroup everything too. So I'm just going to go, release my clipping masks. Sometimes you got to do it more than once depending on how things are. No, just once. And then once they're released, they still come in groups. So I'm going to ungroup that and get all of my layers where they just have pieces of things. Now here I select this and it's just got little red pieces in it, little land bits. And I saw, if I go quickly into outline mode, where's where my clipping masks are, so I'm just going to select those and delete them. Okay, now I got some good pieces here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my graticule here and see what it's made from. There's all these little sort of curved strokes. But there are also curved strokes such that if I find the right ones, I should be able to piece together a circle. Oh, there's actually one at the bottom right here. Very good. Yeah, I've got a circle. That's probably just a line from the graticule that was kind of, that was right along the edge of the globe. So it basically forms the circle that we need to create an ocean. So I could, for example, drop that in here, and I could, if I just changed color on it, that's a background. One thing I can also do, though, a little trick I like to use is to fill in a clipping mask. So if I create a new layer, and we'll call it clipped, and if I put that object here right on that layer, and make sure it's the first thing in the layer, and I put other things in there with it, and I hit the clipping mask button, whatever is here, the very first thing in the layer clips everything else below it, including sublayers. And we got a globe here, so it's hard to tell, but if I were to draw, like, I don't know, a rectangle, that thing is clipped to the circle, even if that rectangle goes in the land layer. And one thing you can do with clipping masks, and again, I probably don't need to in this situation, but I'd like to show this off, is that if you give your clipping mask a fill color, it becomes the background for all of the clipped layers. So I do that with ocean backgrounds a lot. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, let's give ourselves some pretty light land. And I'm going to move this into CMYK mode because I think in CMYK colors a lot. I think about print a lot. And so it's just kind of how my brain has, over time, oriented toward thinking about color. Let me give it a real light cyan background. Something oceany, but something kind of gets out of the way. So land. Let's think about our land here. I'm terrible at choosing colors. That's one reason why I gave a whole talk about NASIS, at NASIS about mapping in monochrome. One of the things I said there was like, there's so many colors. How do I pick? If I map in grayscale, it's just so much easier. But I'm going to give my best here. Let's go with something really light. Like, 8% yellow there. I'm just going to hit Command H here to hide my selection edges. It's still selected, so I can still change colors of things, but now I can kind of see how it looks. Just a real light land. Classic traditional colors of yellow to green land and blue water. Nothing fancy here. All right, one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off my Graticule for a second. One thing I want to do is I want to make this land pop a little bit more. And one way I can do that is a glow. I can make the land pop probably just if I made the color really strong. It's clean and distinct. But if I want them both to be pretty subtle and light, I need something to give just a little bit of darkness around the edge here. And one thing some people do, and you might think of it, well, I could make a yellow stroke, right? I could say, or dark yellow stroke. But I've got a lot of detail here. And I could potentially have used, in fact, the Natural Earth 110 million rather than the 50 million line work set, a little less crunchy almost. I mean, look at the Philippines here. You can't really tell that it's a series of islands. It's just sort of this massive ink now. This is one of the problems with using strokes when your line work is too detailed. Strokes always draw attention to themselves. They pull the eye toward the edge of a shape rather than what's inside, which is often what we really care about. They're great at making distinctions, but I want to be able to do that in a way that's a little bit subtler. And so I want to turn that off for a minute here. I'm just going to cut that out. And so we're going to go with a glow. So I'm going to select the appearance of my land. This little circle here means adjust the appearance of everything inside the layer, rather than adjusting things one at a time for each of my individual objects. So I'm just going to say, let's do a little outer glow. And I don't know why the default is always screen, but the only two blending modes you almost ever need in Illustrator are normal and multiply. Multiply is just kind of like mixing colors together. So if you multiply purple and multiply blue on top of magenta, it's going to give you something purplish. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to say let's go with something like a dark blue. And let's preview that and see what happens. Yeah, here we go. Let's blur that out a little bit more. And let's make that more transparent. I want to be subtle about this. There we go. The idea is you almost can't tell it's there. But it's still doing a huge amount of work to separate the land and the water. If I turn that on and off, you can see how helpful that is. And the same thing, I've got that going on here. I've started to realize this is kind of a pattern for me of doing a lot of outer glows. I used to be very resistant to them when I started out for whatever reason, but there's something that Tanya Buckingham, who is my mentor in all things cartographic, was really fond of, and she always encouraged me to use them, and I've really learned to love glows. You can see here the same thing. It's really kind of doing a lot of work, and I just notice here my layers are terribly disorganized. I'm normally not like layer 7 copy, but this was a map I threw together rapidly. But I've got white land here. I'm just going to hide that edge, and light gray water, and again that they can be very close, but that glow is enough to separate them. And it's enough that no one knows it's there. If I showed this map to a person on the street, they'd say, yeah, there's yellow land and blue water. And they would probably have to think about it for a while to realize that actually the blue gets a little darker the closer in you get to the land. So this is kind of a sweet spot. This is kind of where I want to be. And if you're ever playing around with raster effects and they look a little bit fuzzy, just make sure your resolution in your document raster effects is high, because I can turn this down to screen, and now it looks kind of pixelated if I zoom in. You can kind of see some of the blocks there, but if I make my raster effects high resolution, then that softens up. Yeah, so very good. I should probably save this in case anything terrible happens too. I save very frequently, every several minutes when I'm working, except when I'm demonstrating to people. Then for some reason I usually forget. Yeah, islands. Great, that's what we'll call it, islands. I usually turn off create PDF compatible file. It turns out by default you can load an Illustrator file right into Acrobat and have a look at it, or into other sort of PDF readers, but it takes a lot more space. The files get bigger. So I usually turn that off unless I've got a great reason to do so. As I mentioned before, I kind of don't want the whole world here. So maybe I should focus on cutting that down a little bit. I'm going to move my labels up on top there. My graticule. So let's take everything. I'm just going to Command A, select all. And I've got my edges hidden, so again, you can see all my edges, but I'm just going to hide them here. First off, I want to rotate things. So I'm just going to hit R to go to my rotation tool and go like this, so that we get kind of a more dynamic, interesting perspective. It's not your traditional north-up kind of thing. And then what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to crop in my artboard a little bit, kind of focus myself on the areas I'm interested in. Something like this. Sorry, New Zealand, you're getting cropped out today. There's that sort of running internet joke about New Zealand being left off maps. I'm doing it right now. I'd probably have to think about my projection a little bit more if I really wanted to get New Zealand in there in a way that looked quite as good. It's a big area covering New Zealand all the way up to, in this case, we're getting to like Hainan in China. So it can be tough to kind of fit everything in you want. But I think this is going to be good. And actually what I'm going to do is, instead of my previous plan where I was doing this background clipping mask, I am going to undo that. I said I didn't really need to. Nothing exceeds the globe anyway. And it was just a way to show you things, but I am going to make a clipping mask around this whole box instead. So first off, I'm going to make a new layer, call it Ocean, and I'm just going to take my mask and move it in there and put it in the background. And then I'm going to make a new clipping mask here. And I'm just going to use my smart guides here to kind of get this where I want it, match my artboard pretty well. Again, it's the top thing on my clipped layer, so as long as I highlight clipped, which is not selecting, there needs to be two words for like what happens when you click a layer or an object and highlight its name versus when you actually have it selected. But if I just highlight clipped, doesn't matter what I have selected, nothing at all could be selected. I hit that button, and now everything's gotten clipped. It's all there. If I look at outline, it's still hiding out there if I want to change. And I see people are really unhappy about New Zealand being cut off. Let's see if we can make it work. Hold on. It's just let's. All right, we'll just rotate a little bit more. Just select everything there. We can fit it in. We'll be good. We'll be nice to New Zealand. All right, so now let me crop my clipping rectangle in, and then I'll just auto size my artboard to match that. So I've got my clipping mask selected, and I just say Artboard. Under the Object menu, Fit to Selected Art. This is just, if I were going to export later on, like a JPEG to go on Twitter or something like that, when you say it clips to your artboard. So I just want to make sure that matches my clipping mask. I really don't need the clipping mask at all because nothing outside my artboard would export. But it's just handy for me so that I'm not distracted by all this stuff going on outside here. I want to see what does my final map look like. So I like to hide all that other stuff when possible. So now this is kind of a map of Australia and friends. It's kind of Australia in the middle here. So let's look at some other things we can do. I want to drop my graticule underneath the land That's kind of a traditional thing. You usually see, I think that's probably what some of my exemplars did. Actually, it looks like both of them put the graticule on top. But I've seen a lot of maps like this that keep the graticule underneath and kind of pops the land a little bit more. And especially if you were going to label a lot of things on land, having all these lines overall, if I'm going to put island names on here, that's more competition, definitely. So I'm going to keep these things out of the way. The graticule is really only there for one reason, and to remind somebody of the curvature of the Earth. And even in this map I made before, it could probably have used a little bit of that. It's got a little perspective, and you kind of see the horizon, but it'd probably be more powerful if we had that graticule on there. That's all it's there for. We're not really. I'm not interested in labeling it. I'm not going to put 30 degrees south latitude line or on that. It doesn't matter. It's enough to just help people understand that we're looking at a ball. So I want this thing to be fairly subtle, light. Let's get out of the way with it. So I think white. Let's make it a little bit thicker here. 2 points. Now that white looks maybe like a little bit too much, so I'm just going to say let's give it, 4% cyan. It was my background's 10% cyan, but I think 4% just makes a slight difference there. And I'm kind of, as I look at that, I want to boost my outer glow. I go back to my appearance for everything here and just go to my outer glow and say let's boost that a little bit. 50% here. Okay. It's a little more obvious, but I think that helps against the graticule as well. So we'll keep that for now. Okay, I see that I have some graticule lines running around the edge still, which looks a little awkward. This kind of thing right here. I lock my land here and my everything except my graticule. I want the edge of the world to not be data. I want it to be my background, so I'm just going to delete some of these lines here. And there might be a few of them stacked on top of each other, so I'm just literally selecting some of these until they finally go away. Because it's got probably quite a few pieces of the graticule from the back side of the globe that are stacked on there. If I select that one though and delete it, that's going to get rid of this piece here. I don't want that. So again, this is like, you're seeing kind of the behind the scenes. This is what it's like to face, I don't want to like show you canned things. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to crop this whole thing in a little bit. So we've got my ocean here. Got a circle. That's a really handy circle. So I'm actually going to double clip this thing. I am going to put, I'm gonna clip things to a constrained version of this circle. Just crop it inward a little bit, and then clip that whole thing to my rectangle. That's a little convoluted, and if I had time to think about it, probably could come up with a better solution, but that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to dump all this stuff here in first this extra clipped layer. And I'm going to say, okay, take this thing back out. And we're going to turn it into a clipping mask, but first we're just going to shrink it. It's a circle, so let's just 98%. So we're just going to cut inward a little bit. And now turn that into a clipping mask and make it, 10%. Yeah. So there we go. Now we cut off some of that unsightly stuff where there's some weird stuff floating around the edge and it gets to be, this is the challenge in orthographic things. Things get compressed near the edge. And that's part of their power. I mean, I can see all these islands kind of spreading out into just little thin streaks, and that gives me a visual sense. Oh, they're farther away. They're a ways from Australia. But that starts to look really messy near the edges. And so I like to just crop out that bit there. So I can see there's a little bit more graticule and a little bit more streaks of islands out there. So let's just dump those. And then now I've got everything clipped to that. Let's dump that extra clipped layer in my square clipped one. And doubly clipped. Again, a little convoluted, but I think that makes a nicer appearance. I'm just going to save that there. Okay, so to give us a little bit more of a sense of perspective, I want to add a little bit of a gradient to this globe. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go on top of this whole thing and make a little gradient layer. And I'm going to use that same circle. I'm just going to Alt drag to make a copy of that piece of art. And what I want to do is I want to make this thing. First off, we're gonna apply a gradient to it. My end goal is to just get a little darkening along the edges here, and that's something I've done already before on this example. See how that thing is, how it's got a little darker here than it is down here in the center? And you can do that with a gradient. I could probably also do that by applying a glow as well, an inner glow to this shape. But I want to try it with a gradient first, because that's what I know I did before, so I'm wondering if there's a reason I didn't use a glow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my gradients tool. And I'm going to say, let's do a radial gradient up here. And I've got this white to black, and I could, I could mess around and I could say, change where the black starts, sort of change the overall shape or size, but in this case it's a circle, and so radial gradient fits perfectly. And I could also, you can go to the gradients panel, and if you want to mess around, you can change what colors you're using. In this case, white to black is actually going to be just fine for me, because what I'm going to do, and close this up here, is I want this thing to be set to multiply. And why did that not work quite how I wanted it to? Because multiply ordinarily darkens things underneath. So again, because ordinarily, let's say I've got just an ordinary, black fill. Let's get rid of my appearance here. Let's drop this and just put an ordinary black fill in there. If you have a gray color and you say multiply, it darkens the stuff underneath. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. So, I know what I've done. Sometimes when you take clipping masks and you copy them, Illustrator gets a little confused and thinks they might still be clipping masks. So I'm going to move this into its own layer for a minute. And yeah, now it's less confused about what that was. It just wasn't applying the transparency right because it thought it was still a clipping mask. So oftentimes you have to clip and unclip again and reclip again sometimes when you copy those shapes. So since I had done that before, it even still is calling this gradient a clipping mask when it's not. So I've unclipped it there. Let's do it. And it's set to multiply now. So that white and black, black darkens things, white doesn't do anything. This is super heavy, but let's just crank our transparency down. Let's go like 20. So it's starting to work there. It's kind of darkening everything, so maybe I want to actually edit my gradient and make it so that the black point doesn't start till pretty near the edge. And now we've got something. If I turn that on and off, it's just got a little darkening to the edge of my globe, and that's kind of nice. Okay, so now I'll move that back into my gradient layer, so I remember where it is. Yeah, I like that. And then we'll throw a little outer glow here, just a little atmospheric effect. I'm just going to tell this, target everything in my extra clip layer, which everything in this ball shape, and let's give that whole thing an outer glow. Let's spread that out pretty far. And let's give that a, I don't know, a little greener color. Something speaks to me about that. And let's make it a little darker. And just a subtle greenish glow out in the atmosphere. Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah, so the other thing I was going to test too was could I have just done this edge effect with a glow here, the glow on my clipping mask? I'm not sure I could. because I don't know if you can do inner glows on clipping masks. So I'm just going to test that for a second. Yeah, nothing's happening. So that's why I did that gradient, because clipping masks sometimes have special rules and you can't apply certain appearance effects to them. So now I know why I did the gradient. Oh, thank you. There's an ooh, ah, nice out there. It's always good to have the nicest cheer. And I'm glad you're following along and enjoying this. You know, I like doing these little effects, and it's always the little things, right? Good cartography in here is in the small details. And again, if I showed this to somebody on the street, they're not going to know there's all these glows there. They'd have to spend a while, and I'd probably have to ask some follow-up questions and say, "Oh, look really closely at Australia. What do you see?" But that's what sets these things apart, and yeah, that's that eye for detail. I'm always looking at other people's maps and just really closely seeing what little tiny effects they've applied and what can I borrow for my own work, because we all build on each other. Okay, so I've got kind of my base map down. I think that's going to work out pretty well. I could look at labeling a little bit, maybe, while we have some time. I'm also trying to think, there was another thing I wanted to do, and I don't remember what that is, so that's all right. You know, maybe I'll think of it, or maybe we'll just do another one of these sometime. Who knows? So, yeah. It had to do with the detail. No, never mind. I was going to talk about everything getting overly detailed, and I already said that. But actually, one thing I want to follow up on, you know, this is maybe overly detailed, and that's a real challenge in orthographics, because you need more detail in the front, in the middle, rather than in the back. You know, things kind of get crunchy, as I said, as you start to move around the edge. And the problem with that is that, you know, these data sets are they've been generalized and simplified for situations that are not orthographics, because there's a huge scale variation from the middle of here all the way out to the edge. So sometimes if you really want to be serious about it, you know, I might even take all of this stuff into a GIS where it's doing orthographics correctly and it's calculating some of those coordinates, reproject my shapefiles into an orthographic setup, into an orthographic coordinate system, and then simplify everything using that coordinate system so that everything is kind of being taken as it will be displayed and put it at the same level of generalization. Sometimes there's a little extra GIS work in these things. The same thing too, you know, these buffers around Africa here. If you notice that they actually compress as they get farther back. You know, in Illustrator, I could have just done a little offset. You know, I could have said, like, let's just make these shapes a little bit bigger or give them a thick stroke. But the problem is that stroke doesn't get thinner toward the backside of the globe like it should. So I actually have to go into like ArcMap or Q or something like that and calculate buffers just so that that effect looks right. And honestly, that's probably a detail that most people would never notice. It would probably look just fine under most circumstances, but again, I like to sort of obsess about the tiny details at times. So Ellie, her question is, she's had issues in the past in which with glows weighing down her AI file. Yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, these things, glows can really slow stuff down. Sometimes one of the things I make use of a lot is even, you know, I thought about before I rotated this whole thing is maybe just turning the glow off temporarily while I was working with it, because you do transformations and translations and such, and it wants to redraw the whole glow. So, you know, that saves a little bit of time, just turning them off until you actually need them to happen once you've kind of got them set. But I don't have a magic bullet for that, unfortunately, and simplifying the lines definitely helps. And as Alethea says, maybe knocking back the effects at least while you're working with it. But yeah, there are lots of times when I have a glow applied to a layer and then I say, well, I'm going to move this label, I'm going to move this land. Nope, I got to wait for the whole thing to redraw. They can be a pain, definitely, but they look really nice. So I just get them set up and then kind of turn them off unless they're bogging me down. If they're bogging me down too much. But I hear your concerns on that, definitely. I was going to talk about labeling, yeah. So I've got some labels here, you know, and we only got a few minutes left, so I'm not going to label this whole thing for you, absolutely. But And Dylan says, yeah, simplifying line work down. And this is way too detailed, some of this. I mean, if I select everything, I mean, that's a crazy amount of points. I'd probably want to just, even my like circle that the gradient's applied to, I mean, let's just simplify that. I have a little shortcut here that I've created a custom shortcut to take me to the simplify tool. I use it enough. 100%. There we go. So that probably helped a little bit. So yeah, labeling, you know, this is something we're going to talk about in the next live stream. I love labeling, and I have a lot of opinions about it. You know, quick type layer. But one thing that I haven't really tried out too much with this, that I would like to in an orthographic situation, is throwing a little perspective distortion on labels. So I was going to say, let's do, you know, Australia. And I'm just going to quick center that with the Command-Shift-C and pick a better typeface. Like, I don't know, we'll do Gill Sans. Oh, my Creative Cloud subscription includes... I just upgraded Illustrator, so now it's got, like, every time I do a tool, it's telling me new exciting things that Illustrator does in the latest version. So let's track that out a little bit. Okay, great. So there's Australia. And that looks fine, but one thing I'd like to play around with, I'm going to make a little copy here, is to do 3D rotations of the label. So let's just push this thing back a little bit, like yeah, there we go. And so what if we looked at our label? Actually, I want to go the opposite direction, like that. You see how there's a little bit of perspective distortion there to that thing? And I haven't played around with it. I feel like it might take a little while to kind of get the right angles and such, the revolution, but I feel like there could be something interesting to that. Make it kind of fit the fact that, you know, like it's embedded on the globe itself and is curving away from you, and then the characters are slightly distorted. This is something I've done on a 3D map before, but the nice thing about that 3D map, I got it in my portfolio here, yeah, this thing, was that everything was at the same angle. I knew like my camera angle when I set this thing up, so I knew rotate everything 30 degrees or whatever, and it would all kind of look like it was flat against the rest of it. Whereas, you know, here we're dealing with the globe, and so that's going to be dicier. The angles are changing everywhere. So, yeah, it's something though I'd suggest you might want to mess around with. And certainly if I do an orthographic again, I'm probably going to mess around and see what I could potentially do with that kind of thing. So let's see, we got just a few minutes left. I'm going to think about high priority stuff to talk about. Yeah, you know, in some of these things, I've drawn some lines, little journeys flying around. You know, these aren't great circle lines. I've done those before. You know, if you know about great circles, like, you know, the shortest path between two places along this curved surface of the Earth, it's not necessarily a straight, you know, north to south kind of thing. So I usually just fake those. It doesn't really require, you know, if I say, oh, I'm going to fly from Sumatra to Tasmania kind of thing, it doesn't need to follow the correct exact path. You can calculate those, and I've done that before. I had a whole bunch of routes for that airline map. Eventually, like, this map got revised, so it was actually literally just all the lines left Dubai and went to their individual proper destinations rather than this sort of bundled system. And what I did was I literally just went in GIS and calculated, like, I drew straight lines in an azimuthal system, like you can do it like an azimuthal equidistant, and then had them reprojected so that they would follow the correct curvature of the Earth. But it turns out that drawing them by hand was pretty much just, it was much faster and it looked pretty much just as good. Unless you're flying a plane, you don't need better. So, you know, but I do like to give things just a little bit of curvature, because if I drew this straight, which actually sometimes is what the great circle line turns out to be, it just looks weird against this curve. It just, like, everything is smooth and sweeping and perspective, so introduce a little artificial perspective into your lines if you can do that kind of thing. And you could even get fancy and say, like, what if I tried to make a shadow kind of thing? What if I said, let's make that black, and said, if I blurred it a little bit, I don't know if that's going to work. Yeah, actually the default, I don't know, maybe. Or maybe I'd even curve that shadow a little bit too, but just have it separated away a little bit. That could be fun. I've never done that before. I just kind of made that up, but I think that could be a viable option. So, yeah, so turn it over to you. I mean, you've been saying things, asking questions in the comments. That's great. But before we leave off, I'm just going to give you a chance to speak out further if you have any further questions before I move on to our closing ceremonies and a special announcement. I'll just tease that now. And I'll give you a moment to type things in case you have them. All right, well, in that case, and maybe some of you are still typing, but a couple of things I want to note. First off, a special announcement. It's sort of a pre-announcement. Probably within the next month or so. If you're at NASIS, and you might have caught my presentation on monochrome mapping. I love making maps in black and white and grayscale, and there's a bunch of stuff in my portfolio that's all about that, a high percentage. But this map that we talked about, for example, a couple of months ago, and I think there's not enough attention paid to monochrome mapping. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a monochrome mapping competition. I threatened to do this at NASIS, and I'm getting ready to get it off the ground. Probably in the next month or so, I've got a few things to get all lined up as far as accepting submissions and how to do it in a sort of semi-automated fashion, working with some people on that. But in the meanwhile, start making monochrome maps or start digging things out of your portfolio or finishing projects you might have left around, because I'd love to see as many people as possible submit monochrome maps. And really the goal here is that I want to give some attention to these things and just show how beautiful they can be and the cleverness that people demonstrate when they are working within this kind of system, within these limitations, because it's really a chance to shine and try and do new things and try and see what you can cram in. So that's my plan. I'm pretty excited about that. That'll be running for over this summer, and I got a great set of judges lined up already. So yeah, start spreading the word, and then you want to, when it really launches for real, to find out when that happens, you come back here to the front page of my website, somethingaboutmaps.com, and if you go to my blog, you can subscribe. You can either RSS subscribe or follow, plug in your email address, get updates. So you'll be notified when that happens, or you can follow me here on Twitter at Pinakografos. You can kind of get us, I'll be putting it up there and asking people to spread it around. So yeah, that's the first thing. The second thing, as always, as ever, please give a moment to set aside your thanks for everybody who makes this possible. I mean, the support that all of you have shown is gratifying, and it means a lot to me, and it helps me do things like this, live streaming, monochrome mapping, a few other things I've got going on. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it, and your time too. That's a really important part of it. If no one showed up in the chat, well, this would be really boring, and I could have just recorded this at any time of day that was convenient for me, and I probably would have over-edited it and everything to cut out all the times when I lose my train of thought. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your support. Really appreciate that. And one of the things that we'll be doing is meeting again, hopefully in the near term. So this is, I announced a few months ago a series of 3 live streams I was going to do. This is kind of an experiment, and we've got one more to go in that current series. So we've broken down a couple of maps, and I created a map here in front of you, or at least a large chunk of a map. I mean, it's certainly not done yet, but it's enough to hopefully get some ideas and a sense of what's going on. And I know some of you were saying that you learned some things, which that means a lot to me too. I mean, that's why I'm doing this, and it's always great to see. Next time is going to be a little different. I love typography, as I said, and this is a little bit more freeform. I'm not going to make a specific thing or break down a specific map, But we're going to just talk about labeling in general, some things that I think about it, some of the ways that I approach it, some of my tricks and thoughts, and hopefully some of yours as well. And you've all got experience labeling probably, and you've got your own ways of doing things. So I'd love to hear from you. Maybe I'll poll the audience for favorite typefaces and things like that, or whether or not you are in the debate about. I have people who really don't like curved labels, and people who really do, like me. I hate labeling things on straight lines, and so we can maybe get into some of that too. So hopefully you'll be able to tune in again May 1st at noon in Central Time. And with that, thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.